You're listening to the latest edition of The Lead on News 24 with Graham Rowenheimer. If you've got an opinion on what you've heard so far, drop us a short voice note on our WhatsApp hotline. That's 072 562 3179.
Well, this is The Lead and this is the South African story. My name's Graham Robenheimer and today's day 3 of the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry into allegations of criminal capture of the criminal justice system. Evidence of WhatsApp conversations in particular between General Mkhwanazi and an apparent associate and friend of now suspended Police Minister Senzo Mchunu has offered South Africans somewhat of a glimpse inside the core of the claims being made thus far. Mkhwanazi believes it's rather quote-unquote strange that the mysterious brown Mogotsi, all we know is he's from the Northwest Province, that Mogotsis had unfettered access to crime intelligence information, knew about developments in the ranks of the SA Police Service, and even the daily diary of the Minister. Specialist legal journalist Karen Morn has been following all the proceedings. She joins me in the Lead's hot seat right now to take us through the day's events thus far. Karen, thank you so much for your time. Day 3, can you believe it? We're opening our eyes and, we've made quite a bit of headway in terms of the evidence that's been led thus far. How are you doing?
Yes, I think it's becoming more and more apparent that this will probably be the last day of evidence for Mkhwanazi. But one of the biggest things for me as someone who is a legal journalist was, of course, there was this hectic accusation, essentially, of widespread judicial capture by Mkhwanazi. So much so, Graham, that the MK party actually said, look, DCJ Madlanga should not hear this inquiry because the entire judiciary's hands are dirty. But it now appears that entire assertion was based upon the, bail conditions imposed on the crime intelligence officers by a magistrate. And that was the heart and soul of that allegation. And I think that's going to create a lot of pause about, just the overblown nature to some degree of some of Mkhwanazi's allegations.
I'd like to start here very quickly before we move on through the day's events, if we can, Karen. We can sort of go chronologically. For me, it feels like sometimes the evidence being led by Advocate Selok and the various themes, they move all over the place, right? They don't often always keep within times that we've seen in the first and the second day. There's a big draft coming through. So there's plenty of jumping around happening. And Selok doesn't always, and forgive me, I have a lot of respect for her, but doesn't necessarily always tee up the evidence very well. So it's actually quite of a challenge this time round. And that's the sense I got from our colleague Bernadette Wicks as well, Court and Crime reporter, and a little bit from you in our previous chats. It's been a little bit difficult to follow the proceedings thus far. Your view on this?
Look, I think that in my mind, I am an evidentially minded person. And I think some of the difficulty is that there are very, very serious allegations being made here, including against IDAC, which is like a very important body of the NPA charged with investigating state capture corruption, but also police corruption. There have been allegations against the Inspector General of Intelligence. There have been allegations of essentially MPs and all those individuals, all those bodies somehow being part of a plot to protect a Gauteng drug cartel by seeking accountability from members of crime intelligence who, were not directly involved, but sort of showed oversight over a Gauteng counterintelligence operation that involved the investigation of a drug cartel and, of course, the murder of that engineer, Mr. Swart, that you've done such brilliant work on with our colleague Jeff Wicks. And I just think that, my thing that I keep coming back to is that we know the police are highly factionalized. We are getting a profound sense of that. And ironically enough, of course, Mkhwanazi revisiting those allegations of Richard Mdluli under the Zuma administration, saying, he spoke up about that. He was subjected to attempted political pressure over that. And he's saying this is replicated now. But the big jump between now and then, of course, is that we knew that Mdluli was a Zuma loyalist. Of course, the decisions by the NPA to withdraw his prosecution on corruption charges and in relation to the death of his love rival, Opa Ramokhiba, all those years ago, were subsequently reversed. And there were outcomes in those cases, not necessarily in terms of murder of Ramokhiba, but certainly in terms of aggravated assault, etc. But the difference between that and now is that you having the allegation that all these disparate elements of the criminal justice system have somehow acted in concert to protect the interests of a drug cartel. And Graham, that's a very, very, very
huge,
big jump to make. And so, and I've said this throughout our podcasts, I think that this is going to be about exposing dysfunctionality and factionalism. And I think that the question of the impact on the ordinary South African person who just wants law enforcement to work is going to be profoundly debilitating in terms of creating an us and them environment, which is going to make us all really quite concerned about who is steering this very important ship. We cannot have a scenario where our president goes to the US of A, to Donald Trump and says, it's okay, everyone's getting murdered. And we then have an inquiry which says, essentially, these guys are at each other's throats. It's very apparent from Mkhwanazi's evidence that he substantively believes that that's built up by nefarious purposes. Whether it is or not will be uncovered by this inquiry. But what is very clear is that the people that should be focused on dealing with the issues of criminality in our country, issues like political killings in KZN and elsewhere, are actually fundamentally quite fixated on the idea that nefarious interests or factionalism are driving attempts to unseat and seek accountability from them, and that is disturbing.
And if you just tuned in by seeing the front page of News 24 today, you're listening to The Lead. My name's Graham Robenheimer, in conversation with specialist legal journalist Karen Morn. And it's very important, critical, some would say, to remind us that the words from Terry Matau are so important that all of this needs to be treated with a heavy dose of impartiality. Because already the piece that was published on News 24 this morning, expert work by yourself, Karen, and Bernadette, teaming up to get comment from IDAC, in particular, this investigating arm of the NPA set up because of the strong recommendations from the Zondo Commission, is also going to be giving its evidence to the Commission, so that Mkhwanazi's word cannot necessarily just be taken on the face of it. And we actually got a little bit of narration from him today in relation to some of the text messages that he was showing regarding Brown Mogotsi. He was like, hey, we don't know what Mogotsi's cell phone looks like, or Mr. Police Minister Senzo Mchunu, the suspended minister's cell phone records look like, because they would also have to come to the Commission and give their evidence too.
And so will Becky Kele. I mean, our colleague Jeff Wick's done excellent work looking at, for instance, Becky Kele, getting trips at like a hotel accommodation, etc., etc. 3
different occasions that they've been put together.
And I mean, that is seriously questionable. And I mean, that is problematic. I mean, you see, the thing is that we must always remember that many things can be true at the same time. The big question for me coming out of this morning's evidence, which I think was a pivotal piece of evidence, is how did Brown Mogotsi know that the political killings task team was going to be disbanded on the 31st of December.
Yeah, that's crazy.
On the day that letter is sent. I've seen that letter.
And people are getting ready, like the Mkhwanazi had stated, and I think it's a very fair comment that he had made. People are getting ready for New Year's
Eve. Exactly.
Offices are closed. How would this alleged associate, comrade, in inverted commas, of the now suspended police minister have that critical information?
And say these people that are raided you, and then also this assertion that the dockets are going to go back to Sabia's office. Shadrach Sabia, of course, the Deputy National Commissioner of Police, who, now suspended. And, of course, they're fundamental disquiet about the fact that 121 PKTT dockets then go to his office in Pretoria. And, of course, according to Mkhwanazi, very little or no evidence, or no work is done on those
cases.
There
were 5 slam dunk arrests, according to Mkhwanazi. That could have been done, and they weren't.
And they're not returned to the police stations where the officers who were potentially would be able to further them. So big question mark there is, is that just rampant incompetence? But how would Mogotsi have known that Sabia was going to, he said, the dockets are on their way to Sabia. Sabia only makes that request in March. So, those are the nuggets where I think, okay, there is a case to answer. Some of the more overblown things of a widespread criminal conspiracy involving IDAC, the IGI, and 2 MPs, I think that we have to demand and expect hardcore evidence before we believe that is true, because I think that's a bridge too far. But I think that the big question for me, having seen the exchanges and having Mkhwanazi go through them, is how the hell did Brown know that? And, I mean...
Access to the minister's daily diary.
Well, I mean, I suppose in fairness, one could say that Lusiki Siki massacre, which is why he was going to the area, was highly publicized. We have a 24-hour news environment. It would have been very evident that the police minister was going there. But the letter was not public knowledge. I wrote about it a few days after it was released, and it was then on WhatsApp groups. And Mkhwanazi and Masamolo at that stage, they hadn't been engaged with at all. We know that the head of the KZN NPA had no clue. No one who should have known about it knew about it. But apparently Mogotsi and Kat Matlala did, and I think that's a big question.
Let's go to that right now, Karen. Is those text messages that Mkhwanazi then brought as with Advocate Sello's help. The one reads Mogotsi to Matlala as narrated by Mkhwanazi. A lot of M's, sometimes you've got to remember names. Once the disbandment letter goes out, right, on just after New Year's, today is the day, just stand back. That's the message from Mogotsi to Matlala. Then later, and this is again speaking about the disbandment of the political killings task team on the very same day that this message goes out. Mogotsi then informed Matlala that he would be meeting with General Sabia and then the minister to find some sort of solution, and then tells Matlala that the team that came to harass you prior has now been disbanded, so you don't really have to worry now. And quote unquote, as we speak, they're bringing all the dockets to Sabia. It's quite illuminating.
And it's very specific knowledge. So, there has to be an explanation for how he knew that, and how that information was conveyed. There's also been some other evidence, which of course is not necessarily substantiated at this point, but this bizarre story about Brian Mogotsi boasting about the fact that he'd been part of the operation in Tanzania that resulted in the arrest of Thabo Bester. Only in this country would such a narrative be possible. I mean, the Thabo Bester story is so unique.
You've watched the Netflix docu, right?
I haven't,
by Anthony.
but I'll watch it over the weekend because we're here.
Our colleague Tankiso Maketa's in it, and
he's going to be brilliant. Tankiso is the G.
He's really, and I hope Tank is listening. He's probably not. He's very busy, man.
Yes.
But he was one of my favorite figures in the docu. Just as a quick side note, because he tells it like it says on the tin, right? Very quickly on this text messages, just to go back, Mogotsi to Matlala mentioned something about a 3 billion rand contract that Mkhwanazi wasn't aware of, because we know about the failed 365 million.
Services,
yes, that was cancelled after all of the arrest and for the failed hit on actress Tobogo Tobojane, as allegedly led by Vusi Musi Kat Matlala. But 3 billion rand? I mean, that sounds like a massive deal.
This is the fascinating thing, is that we have to understand that within the political economy of the South African environment, people, and unfortunately because the endemic nature of our corrupt system, people who are perceived to have access to power have huge amounts of leverage. And you can see the fact that, Brown Mogotsi was trying to do that. He was trying to get Mkhwanazi on side. These guys are plotting against you. I have access to this information. And I don't think he necessarily perceived the fact that Mkhwanazi was not going to be acquiescent to necessarily, supporting his interests. But the fact that I think that there was this kind of culture of him as a person who had on his own version, but we don't know if, Mkhunu's given different accounts saying at one stage he didn't know this person and now
then
it's
calls
his
him a comrade, yeah.
He's my friend, etc. So there's been a lot of disparate versions of that, and that's going to be a very important thing for the minister to explain. But it's very clear that Mogotsi wants Matlala and also wants Mkhwanazi to know, I'm connected. Like, I know people. I'm going with, we don't know what Feroz Khan, we know.
I want us to get into that now. Can we, Karen?
Yes,
because,
absolutely.
It all started a little bit before tea, and just bear with us if you just tuned into the
it's a lot of stuff to get through, guys. Yes. We're trying to get through everything.
Yeah. Mkhwanazi starts off with the scene being set at the Richard Bay Mineral Mining Company,
yes.
And there's these murders happening. It's allegedly involving executives. He first sends out his task team to stay there for a year. They're not really cracking any cases. He pulls them back, and then Karen, take us from there.
Well, essentially what he says is that they were effective in certain policing functions, but they weren't solving the cases that they were supposed to. So he then pulls them back, and then he says that Fani Masamolo contacts him and says, "I've got a call from the presidency. They're very unhappy, and these officials must go back to the mine." And at the same time, he's hearing from Special Task Team people and National Intervention Unit people.
Yes. And these are like the SWAT guys.
Yeah,
basically.
These are the SWAT guys. They're not investigators. They call him and say, "Look, you need to send detectives here." Because we obviously need detection services. And he makes a lot of the fact that essentially the police were being deployed as a mechanism to protect a mine and not to support the community. And I mean, that's also going to be a red rag to a bull in KZN, where there is so much endemic violence and very, very high crime stats, as there are around the country. That's going to be very, very jarring. And of course, that other nugget of evidence that came out later, where he said essentially Senzo Mkhunu on his version, and of course we don't know what the minister will say about this, rocked up in a particular area and asked about a case against a councillor who had resigned from his position and was now campaigning for another party. I think we can all suspect who that party may or may not be. And then says that, that there was a case of mistaken identity because it was actually the councillor's brother who had the criminal charge against him. And we don't know what Nkunu's response will be, but he says, I think that they would have asked that the councillor get arrested to circumvent his competition. And he says very clearly that the minister was pursuing ANC interests in that context, trying essentially to leverage his power as the police minister to take out the competition for the ANC.
Yeah.
And that is also a very serious allegation.
Yeah, thanks for tying that together, because it was two different parts of testimony that you're now linking together, and that's our specialist legal journalist, Karen Morney, so expertly does that. Bernadette Wicks, meanwhile, inside, taking her lunch break, interference claims, an effort to get Mkhwanazi to back off from CI boss Feroz Khan commission hears. This is our latest piece on the front page of News 24, if you just want to go and get a bit of more of a synopsis, where it now brings in the former police minister, Becky Cele. So Mkhwanazi comes out and he claims that claims that he interfered with investigations into a senior prison official, correctional services official, were rehashed a year later by a Sunday news publication, essentially, to try and to get him to back off from the crime intelligence boss that Mkhwanazi presided over in a disciplinary hearing. There's very interesting backdoor dealings happening here that Cele suddenly re-emerges into.
So his version of this, and again, I mean, this is highly speculative, and we don't.
This is not gospel.
Yeah, so we are going to have scenarios where there have been incidents where Mkhwanazi has said, well, Khumalo, who's the head of crime intelligence, we have phone records, we have other people will testify about this. We also have scenarios where undercover cops are going to come in and talk. So many of that, unfortunately, we won't see, but. The version on this one is that essentially at the time when this is all happening, Mkhwanazi gets this call from Becky Cele, who asks him about a colleague of his, a guy named Khumalo, not the crime intelligence, head, and says, look, I want to bring him out of retirement because the Premier of Gauteng, who I think is Panyaza Lesufi, has asked me to deal with crime in Gauteng, and I need someone to help me. And he asks about Khumalo, and he says, essentially Khumalo is going to have to retire, resign, and come and work for him in Gauteng.
But then Mkhwanazi says they don't like each other.
Yes, and Mkhwanazi's like, I was very surprised because these guys, basically paraphrasing, hate each other. Well, Becky Cele does not like this man. And he then phones Khumalo and says, what gives? And Khumalo's like, oh no, it's because I'm doing a disciplinary hearing against Feroz Khan. Now, in the police environment, there's two types of DC hearing. There's an expeditious disciplinary inquiry, which is somewhat differently structured, I think a lot more fast. And then there's a second, more in-depth one. And Feroz Khan successfully challenged the expeditious hearing and had it referred to a more more protracted process. And Mkhwanazi says then he gets asked to preside over that case, which is essentially to do with Feroz Khan's actions, which Mkhwanazi actually lauded, to prevent the potential theft of drugs from a police operation, right? So he says that it was when he was chosen to be the presiding officer in this Khan matter, was the time when of course he then has the Sunday newspaper story come out about him, and he says, there's a picture and people don't necessarily read, it's behind a paywall, which we know very well. You don't necessarily know, you just see sorry guys, but it's worth the money, I promise you.
Yes, absolutely.
Support good journalism.
100%.
So he's saying, look, and then my name is dragged through the mud, and that's how he sort of regarded that report.
Yes.
And he says he ultimately clears Feroz Khan. Of course, we don't know. But he says that he believes that the Brown Mogotsi tour of Tanzania with alleged Thabo Bester, retrieval.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to say it.
And Dr. Nandipa Magurumana.
Yes, exactly. Which, of course, is somewhat problematic for the state, because their version on that is that it was a deportation and the police weren't involved. So it's a bit unfortunate that this information is being spiced into the ether, because Magurumane, of course, is in court challenging the process that was got her out back. So this is, I think the NPA might be wringing their hands at this point. But moving swiftly on, he's saying that was as a consequence of his perception that Mogotsi was attached to Feroz Khan, and that there was some kind of relationship between him, which he's also suggested enabled Mogotsi to potentially get access to crime intelligence documents.
Right. I think we've covered a hell of a lot. I've got two other
proud of us.
Yes, I'm very proud of you, Karen. And we've got two other side issues that I thought I'd just introduce as quick topics before we end off this edition of The Lead. Mkhwanazi's very charming at times.
Yes.
Hey? There was this one little moment, it's a bit of a lighter moment, where something falls and there's a big bang sound.
Yes.
And then
we all jump 3 feet into the air. I mean, in the environment, you have to understand, there's been bomb sweeps, there have been sniffer dogs. Mkhwanazi is surrounded by bodyguards. They're very surreptitious, they're very effective, but you are very aware of them, and they sort of do a thing to kind of prevent people from getting too close to him.
Sure.
So, and I remember asking a question of Jeremy Michaels and saying, does he have protection? Because the inquiry is obligated legally to protect witnesses and potential witnesses. And he said, quote unquote, he has his own protection. So there is this kind of like anxiety here. And I think we've all felt it. That's why you were so rightfully asking those questions about security, because there was this apprehension of something potentially problematic happening. And this is in an environment where we are seeing criminals getting more and more kind of flagrant in their violations and abuses, to the point where people are getting shot outside court. So that's all a very long-winded way to say that when the sound system occurred and it was like a poof, like everyone wanted to dig.
He responds with, don't worry, you're safe. That's what Mkhwanazi said.
You know what the classic was? That everyone twitched, like visibly. I jumped 3 feet in the air. Bernadette's got her arm on me because I'm like, we all have PTSD, we're journalists. And he just does not flinch. The man doesn't flinch. He's like, it's okay, you're safe. It was quite a moment.
Whereas I was snug in the media room with nice aircon, Karen, I must just say, because
we need it today.
Yes,
sure.
100%. Look, final comment. I thought this was also very pertinent. The Umkhonto weSizwe parties failed in their interdict to temporarily halt the commission's proceedings. I mean, the writing was kind of on the wall.
Absolutely.
As us journalists who have dealt with this for such a long time.
No doubt they will blame the court and say it's all corrupted.
Right. But Jeremy Michaels, the spokesperson, was saying yesterday 50 million views of day one of the commission, right? That's like, what? The entire population of South Africa to an extent.
Yeah, that's quite a surprise.
I wanted to end with this. I think back to the darkest days of apartheid, and I'm talking about the Verwoerd Vorster regimes. Yes. Commissions of inquiry were done under cloak and dagger.
No one had any idea, absolutely.
And a lot of the information was kept away from the public. We should be grateful, I think, when we just take a step back after all of this and look, we're lucky to be getting all the details out in the open. And I think commissions, whether or not you think they are over-exploitative in terms of the taxpayers doling out, or whether you think it's a big waste of time with recommendations that don't happen, at least these things are being said out in the open.
Yes, because the alternative is that, this enters into the realm of speculation and people don't know whether we are dealing with malice, incompetence, or both. And I think it's very, very I think that those kind of answers are incredibly important. And one cannot also forget that the state capture inquiry was the first time, and I don't think any other country has done this, in real time interrogating its own corruption and irregularity and malfeasance. Not years after the fact when everyone involved is deceased, but in the real times, in the original time frame. But I think inevitably, Graham, the frustration is always, as I've said before, when you go through a scenario where you open the body politic and you expose all the cancer, all the rot, and then the people who have the power to take that illness out do absolutely nothing about it, it ends up being very, very damaging to society. So hopefully with the GNU, with a new kind of government structure, with an awareness that the ANC has for the first time that it is not guaranteed power, and with an overwhelming public frustration for this kind of criminality and malfeasance, this will be the inquiry that bucks the trend, and we have to live in hope for that.
Yeah, I completely agree. In 1 minute, what are we going back to now with Mkhwanazi still on the stand? He's already sort of detailed that the two big names that he's dropped is Minister Mkhunu, and he's talked about the MPs. What are we going back to, Karen?
I think that it's really going to be the tail end of his testimony. I think that that's the extent of it, to be honest. I mean, I had heard that he was expected to finish today. And I think that, we've heard the allegations about the judiciary being the magistrate. He has also had some comments about journalists and what have you being maneuvered to push certain narratives about people.
A certain Sunday publication.
Yes, exactly. But I think that this is possibly the extent of it. I mean, he may well, as he is wont to do, Graham, want to say some things at the end of it, but I suspect that we are going to wrap up his evidence, and then, of course, he will have people supporting him, like, for instance, Dumisani Kamalo, for head of crime intelligence, potentially Elaine Harrison Nizingo, who was the NPA head, who is the NPA head in KZN. We know prosecutors, etc., and then, of course, the response of the people that he's implicated to the accusations made against them.
And that's specialist legal journalist at News 24, Karen Morn. We actually got a message from another broadcast legend, Annika Larson, who messaged me. It's her birthday today, and she said,
"Happy birthday, Annika!"
And she said, "We have such fantastic on-air chemistry."
Oh, we love her.
It's the Karen Morn and Graham Robenheimer show right here on The Lead, and this is the South African story. Of course, it's been day 3 of the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry. Just heard from Karen that it looks like the General Mkhwanazi's evidence might be wrapping up by the end of today. Of course, there's a public holiday next week, which also puts a little bit of the spanner in the works. But we've seen evidence of WhatsApp conversations between Mkhwanazi and an apparent associate and friend of now suspended Police Minister Senzo Mkhunu. He's offered South Africans a glimpse inside the core of the claims. Mkhwanazi believes it's quote-unquote strange that this very mysterious Northwest resident Brown Mogotsi is this unfettered access to crime intelligence info. He knew about developments in the ranks of the SAPS and even the daily diary of the minister. Karen Morn and, of course, our colleague Bernadette Wicks will keep us abreast of all the developments as we wrap up on day 3 of the commission at 4 o'clock today. That's The Lead. Thank you so much for tuning in. News 24, cast of thousands.
New episodes of The Lead air Monday through Thursday at 7 p.m. Looking for a smarter weekend scroll? The Weekender is your ultimate guide to bold stories, sharp opinion, and a fresh lens on life in Mzansi. From exclusive interviews and powerful essays to wine picks, playlists, and pop culture gems, it's your perfect weekend read all in one place, landing every Saturday on News 24.